Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. I'm very pleased to have special guest today, Saurabh Sharma. So, Saurabh, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
Saurabh is the president of American Moment, which is a youth-focused new conservative organization in D.C. Really an interesting young Generation Z conservative guy. And we had a conversation the other day on the phone. I said, well, this is really interesting stuff. I'd like to bring some of this to you. So this is going to be a political discussion, not a religious discussion, but it'll be relevant to a lot of people because it's going to help give you a sense of the landscape of what is going on with American conservatism today and how younger people are seeing the world. So I'll tell you right now that the site for American Moment is americanmoment.org. So you can visit that as your leisure, and we'll try to re-up that throughout. And then don't forget to hit the subscribe button on YouTube if you haven't already. So again, thank you for joining. So you are Gen Z. You are a Gen Z conservative, right?
Yeah, I'm on the tail end. I'm the oldest of the Zoomers, as I like to say. So, 23 years old. I think 1998 is fair game. That's when I was born. So there's some people who are purists who would say you have to be born after 2000. Those people are wrong, and it is okay to be wrong once in a while. But and then there's others who says it goes all the way back to 1995, which I firmly disagree with. I think that's ridiculous. Those are old people. They're practically boomers. I think 1998 is basically where it starts.
Well, it's good to be 23 and the president of your own organization in D.C. That's a good place to be.
It is. I try not to let any imposter syndrome kick in once in a while.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about you because I don't know everything about your background, but you have sort of an interesting journey already. Made a lot of moves in your life, but I'm really interested in the Gen Z experience of the world as a conservative, because so much of called the boomer, and again, anybody older than you is a boomer, I think is what she says.
Absolutely.
I'm Gen X, but I might as well be a boomer. But I can remember Ronald Reagan when he was president. I was in high school in the 1980s, and I remember Reagan. So people love to talk about Reagan, the Cold War, all this stuff. Generation Z doesn't remember the Cold War. And I think everybody's like, oh, yeah, they kind of don't do that. But you don't even remember 9/11. You don't remember W, as president. And, that's pretty amazing that I think you're probably the only Gen Z life experience of a Republican president is Donald Trump. Can you help people to understand kind of the lived experience of how Gen Z sees the world, especially from a conservative perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first political memory that I can think of, I was a middle school student, I think in sixth grade. Now, granted, I for some reason, I don't have super robust memories of myself when I was younger than that. So this may not be a universal experience with people my age. But the first memory I have is getting into it for absolutely no reason. I knew nothing about the topic with someone at the lunch table about Obama versus Sarah Palin, and for some reason I didn't like Sarah Palin at the time. I think she's pretty great now, but I for some reason I didn't like Sarah Palin, and I was a defender of Obama. And at some point, we were getting into, I think maybe even some profanity was thrown back and forth, and one of the teachers came by and just said, "Leave politics to the adults," and I was like, okay, fair enough, we'll do that. And then I think the second political memory I have is actually from when I was living in India for my 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. I distinctly remember it being a big news item the day that Osama bin Laden was killed, and watching that speech that Obama gave and everything. And those are basically the two early political memories that I have. So yeah, no memory of 9/11. I used to think I had one, and then I once interrogated it with my parents. They were like, no, we weren't in that place at that time, so it's not real. So it's a complete false memory that I have. So no memory of that either. I mean, I would have been 4, if that. So yeah.
It's just amazing. I always do these things about we've been at war in Afghanistan now long enough for people who were born after 9/11 to be deployed there. I mean, it's really insane to think about how fast time goes. I have this little saying that anything that happens within our memory seems like just yesterday, but anything that happens before we can remember seems like it's in the far distant past. And, so things that when I was growing up, everybody was talking about Vietnam War. And I just remember how I thought about Vietnam. I thought Vietnam was just like World War II or World War. It happened a long, long, long time ago. But in fact, the fall of Saigon was probably only 2 or 3 years before I really started remembering events. And, the last troops was it 72, 73. I can't remember exactly when the last combat troops left Vietnam, but like Vietnam had happened right before. I was alive during the Vietnam War. I just didn't remember it. And yet it seemed like just a foreign country to
Yeah.
me because I didn't remember it. Whereas, even disco, which I remember like part of the disco era, I really probably didn't get the whole thing, but I remember hearing disco songs on the radio. So I'm like, oh yeah, disco, I remember that. And so you mentioned beef. So you were born in India,
Yep.
and then you spent a lot of time in Texas, and now you're in DC. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey
Sure.
of that.
So the Texas part actually came later. So I was born in Bangalore, India. When I was 3 months old, we moved to the United States. My dad was already there. He had started working, I think, for Singular at the time. He's been in telecommunications his entire life, and so my family moved there. When I was 3 months old, we lived in Lexington, Kentucky, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Seattle, LA, LA, Seattle, LA again, Atlanta, moved to a different place in Atlanta, then moved back to India for my 8th, ninth, and 10th grade, which was very formative in its own ways, then moved to the North Dallas area, and then I went to school at the University of Texas at Austin. I spent 5 years in Austin, and now I'm in the swamp. I'm in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
so a windy journey to get here.
Yeah. There are a number of prominent Indian Americans in American conservatism, but if you look at the polling data, they tend to lean Democrat. I think pretty high skew voted for Biden. How did you get drawn into conservatism?
Yeah, I would say that I had a couple of priors that probably led to me becoming a political conservative, or maybe politically on the right, maybe a more apropos term. The first would be that growing up, I was just very reflexively traditionalist to my core. That's sort of how my parents raised me, and it stuck for whatever reason. I never felt the need to sort of sharply rebel from that. I wasn't a perfect kid by any stretch, but I always felt like I had a kind of internal sense of justice. I didn't really like degeneracy that much, that sort of thing. And then when moving around a lot sort of gave me a broad perspective on what works and what doesn't in society. I think there's an old sign and there's an old saying in kind of social science, which is that you don't know one country unless you know two, and you don't really know one kind of social setting unless you know more than one. And so I think it gave me sort of perspective on things I liked. One example would be I lived in places that had pretty high high rates of immigration, and places that had much lower. Lexington, Kentucky, and Albuquerque, New Mexico have a lot fewer, say, Indian Americans than some place like LA. That gave me all sorts of priors on sort of assimilation and how that can be done properly, and how numbers of immigrants tends to be pretty relevant there. So there I get some priors on immigration, had sort of these socially conservative priors. Going back to India for 3 years really gave me a lot of interesting perspectives on law and order, and how precious that is, and how sort of civilization is really a thin veneer that you scratch away at your peril. And so, watching cops get paid off and kind of petty corruption in India was pretty troubling to like a young idealistic kid. So it made me appreciate what we had in the United States a lot more. And then moving to Texas, I love Texas and I love Texans. And so I always really enjoyed, what characterized that state. And so I often found that a lot of them were conservatives, a lot of them were Christians, and that sort of also factored into my worldview. And then kind of a hodgepodge of other things, and 2016 election happens, and I start watching on YouTube different rallies from different candidates, and listening to this Bernie Sanders fellow, that sounds interesting, listening to this Trump fellow, that sounds interesting too. And sort of found myself leaning politically on the right, and definitely kind of the more populist nationalist strain of right that President Trump had represented.
And when did you get involved working for conservative organizations?
So I first got involved in politics my sophomore year of college. I had so that summer I had been taking classes, but all my friends were gone, so I was watching way too many YouTube videos, and that's when I was watching all those rallies and everything. And I wanted to get involved, and I thought I liked at the time, some of the candidates, and so I wanted to get involved. And there was an organization on campus called Young Conservatives in Texas that was getting involved in substantive ways, walking for the candidates, block walking, things like that. And so I was like, okay, cool, I'm going to join these guys. And I did, and kind of very quickly rose up through the ranks, and was thinking, okay, how do I get substantively involved? I was pre-med, I was a biochemistry major. That's what I graduated with, and I was thinking, okay, could intern, and then I decided just to go full bore, and so I took off my entire second semester of my sophomore year of college, and I was the youngest full-time staffer in the Texas state legislature, working with
Wow.
then state senator, now Congressman Van Taylor, and so got my feet wet pretty rapidly. There was a special session that year as well, so it went from January of I guess it would have been 2017 all the way through October of that year. Worked 9 full months in the legislature, and it was a bug that I caught and couldn't let go of, and kind of rest is history.
Wow. So you took time away from college to go work in politics, but you went back.
I did.
Sounds like
I
I
did.
did get your degree.
I did. My parents would have killed me if I decided to quit. And I definitely took them for a little bit of a ride. They sent me to college thinking they were going to get a doctor out of it. Then I thought I'd be a lawyer, and now I'm a notoriously underpaid nonprofit executive. So
No, well, that's great. Your organization's called American Moment. What is the moment in America that you're talking about?
yeah, I think that there is civilizational crises that are faced in the country, and our leaders are not responding to them. And if we don't, then this great country will be irreparably damaged. That's the moment I think we find ourselves in. There's renewed political energy. There's an opening of space on questions that have been sort of staid and decadent and decrepit for a long time. President Trump opened the door to a new vision of politics, and I think that we have an opportunity right now to really act on a lot of big upcoming crises that the country is facing, whether it's cratering marriage and fertility rates, whether it's the rise of China as a geostrategic competitor, a true alternative regime type to the United States, or just the complete lack of any national confidence or solidarity that we see in the United States. All of these are civilizational crises facing the country that require responses that are well tuned to those challenges, not the challenges of some previous time, some previous moment. And so that's why we use the title American Moment. It's funny, one of the criticisms we got when we first named it that, people were like, well, isn't that a little bit of a transient or temporary sounding name for an organization? And I was like, yeah, it should be, because I think the idea that political organizations can last 5 decades, half a century, exist through fundamentally different paradigms of politics is sort of a lot of what's wrong with Washington, D.C. I have sort of first principles values that I care about, and the threats to those values are different in every time we find ourselves in. So we are interested in meeting the challenges of this American moment. We think that we're useful for this American moment. I don't think that I'm necessarily going to be useful for the next one or the previous one.
Well, you hit on something that I totally agree with. And I said this before the election. I said, if you look at Trump, Trump is the bell curve of outcomes, if you will, on the Trump administration has got very fat tails.
Yeah.
So, you get you have a very broad range of possible outcomes with him. Whereas with Hillary, you kind of know what you're going to get. She's got pretty narrow tails. Yeah. And so if your if your belief is that something is wrong in America and we need to make a fundamental, substantive change of direction, then Trump was the candidate, maybe the only candidate in the race that really offered the possibility of something new. And I always said, look, those possibilities could be bad. There's a lot of bad possibilities. But there's also maybe good possibilities, and then there's also just that it creates different space. So I think certainly Trump put things in play that may not have been in play for a very long time if we'd gone for, if Hillary had been elected.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the opportunity that the president provided is in some ways the greatest thing that he gave to the country, because we were down a pretty dark path. I mean, that fat-tailed distribution that narrow band of options that you described for Hillary Clinton, it was bad and worse. I mean, we would live in a pretty dark country, I think, today if Hillary Clinton had her way for 4 years. And so on that alone, I think it was worth voting for the president. But I also think that on its own terms, even during the primary, especially in retrospect, but I would hope if I knew what I knew now at the time, just about broader worldview questions, that it would be obvious even then that this guy had an answer to questions that had been ignored for a very long time and that were being ignored by the rest of that field of 16 candidates as well.
I was really struck in a campaign how controversial it was that Donald Trump said the Iraq War was a mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, that was something like, to me, it was self-evidently a mistake. And, you look back at it and say, wow, how could you possibly defend this? And yet you almost had to ritually rep the decision. And he was the only one who didn't. And it was like, how could this horrible guy say that?
Yeah, I mean, it was, what was the chant you had to say in the Republican Party of yore? In the name of free trade, endless wars, and mass immigration, amen. That was that was the troika, and there was no more pious thing to be held onto than the Iraq War, because that was the ultimate responsibility of the previous Republican president. And so to criticize it was considered anathema, and breaking open that Overton window of discourse is something that we just have to be grateful to President Trump for doing, because countless lives, countless riches have probably been saved over the last couple of years, whereas another president with a different mindset on that would have gotten us into war. I mean, I'm thinking about how many flashpoints there were during the Trump administration where we could have easily slid into another war in the Middle East, where we did. And
Syria,
instead,
for example.
Yeah, Syria, Iran. I mean, North Korea. I mean, there are 100 different things that could have gone wrong during the Trump administration that didn't. And the coffers of the state and the blood of innocent Americans have been preserved because of it.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I always say about the church is that we've entered this new era in which the old formulas of the 80s or the 90s or 2000s, these different formulas that had kind of worked for different people in the past, were no longer working. And I think we're sort of like that in the political world. There was this old formula about Reagan, there's old formula conservatism, and now we're in this range where the old formulas are breaking down. But you're having not had to spend your life marinated in an old paradigm. How do you think that affects your ability to respond now?
I think it makes it a lot easier, and this is where I think a certain level of epistemic humility is helpful. We just did an episode of our podcast, Moment of Truth, with Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And we were talking about the Iraq War, and he very graciously admitted that he had at the time been wrong about it when he was younger. And one thing that I always like to say to kind of younger conservatives in my orbit, young, bold, boisterous people who are extremely anti the Iraq War now, is I like to say, realize that it's probably the case, if you had been alive at the time the Iraq War was being declared, that you would have supported it.
Didn't Hillary vote for it?
Yeah, Hillary voted for it, but even the most bold, right-wing conservative kids probably would have too, because the set of information we had at the time, plus the overwhelming social pressure to conform, was such, and that requires a level of humility that I think a lot of people don't have, and kind of the response to that then becomes that people end up getting married to the paradigm that they grow up in, that they form in, the alliances they form. I mean, we talk about this fusionist consensus on the right of social conservatives, economic libertarians, and foreign policy hawks. If all of your friends and political allies over the last 40 years have been around that coalition, it's very, very hard to pivot. And at the end of the day, we're talking about humans. We're not talking about godly organizations. We're talking about human beings who form human organizations. The idea that they could pivot on a dime to meet the challenges of this time is a lot to ask. And so that's why you need constant renewal and a refreshing of the organizations, the people that are involved, people who aren't tied down by old orthodoxies for ultimately human reasons. You need a new set of players and a new set of characters.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. And not just a lot of old kind of formulas are kind of going away. Personal relationships have been ruptured. And you see a lot of these never Trumpers, who've essentially repudiated the party. A lot of them say, I'm no longer a Republican, no longer a conservative. I'm going over here. You see the same thing in kind of the religious world, too. A lot of, people who you would have said we're all on the same side here. Now they're in different camps, and they're like even opposed to each other, and maybe even bitterly complaining. I mean, some of the never Trump stuff you get from some of these guys are like, whoa, this is a little over the top, man. I mean,
yeah.
And so I do think it's interesting that, I think I know people who've we were good personal friends, and now we'll probably never speak again. Who are in kind of, you would have said they were in the conservative movement, and now it's really blowing things up, and so it's good to not be. It's good to not have some of those things, to let you do it. I do want to talk about American Moment a little bit, but first I got to ask you, like, what is going on with conservatism on campus? When I was in college, right, it was the college Republicans was like a big thing. I was involved with it for like a semester, and I thought it was a little strange. It wasn't really like my thing. And to be honest, I spoke at a college Republican thing, a few years ago, and I'm like, wow, it's still kind of strange. I'm sure at that. So there's like college Republicans, and then there's like Turning Points USA, which has now got big. So it seems like there's always new little groups coming on. What's going on campus with conservatives these days?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of trends that are worth pointing out. The first is that I think a lot of the trends of sort of left-wing domination have accelerated over the last couple of years. They are not novel. That is one thing that I will always say. There's people who will say, man, campus was never this crazy. It was. I know people who were involved in kind of conservative activism on campus in the 80s and 90s. It was pretty much always this bad, if not worse in certain cases. It's just that now we have a camera lens on it. Campus Reform can take a video of some nutty thing happening on a college campus. It makes this rounds on Fox, it makes the rounds on talk radio, and awareness has gone up. I think Campus Reform for at least a couple of years in a row has been the number one cited news source on Fox News. There's now a well-oiled machine to publicize incidences of bias on campus, incidences of like wacky left stuff. And so that's part of the reason why we're more aware of it. And I think there's more interest. It's part of the reason that groups like Turning Point USA have gotten all of this attention, is because they purport to have an answer to some of these questions on campus. Another trend that I think is important to recognize is the shift away from a student activism oriented mindset to a campus lecture oriented mindset. So it used to be the case that the primary thing that campus organizations would do was sort of do their own activism, kind of advocacy for the issues, for winning converts, block walking, that sort of stuff. I think that's changed since probably about 2014 or so, since sort of Milo Yiannopoulos did his campus tours. There's now a much bigger premium on having big flashy speakers, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Andrew Klavan, so much of friends of mine. That's just, and it's not a good or bad thing. It's just a difference. These speakers get brought in some ways to be the avatar or sort of the kin spirit of the students, the conservative students on campus, and sort of do battle with the lefties. And that's sort of the new orientation of how activism works. And so those are, I think, kind of two interesting trends worth pointing out. But I think that there's also, been a little bit of a die down since Trump got elected. I would say probably the campus activism stuff probably reached its peak in around 2017. Since then, things have definitely gotten a little bit quieter. A lot of the speakers that got famous are doing less rounds on campus than they once were. And there's not a lot of new speakers getting famous. And so there's just been an interesting kind of cooling down. At some point, I'm sure that there'll be kind of an inflection point and people will go back to doing kind of individual activism, or maybe there'll be new kind of charismatic leaders that show up that want to do the campus circuit. But we're in an interesting sort of cooling off period, I think, for a lot of the college campus stuff.
Yeah, the college speaking thing was really interesting. It was, for a certain group of people at a certain point in time, it was an amazing brand builder. So if you are like Ben Shapiro, I think we just did an incredibly strategic thing by going onto these campuses where he knew there was going to be protests. And so this really let him credentialize himself as someone who's willing to go into the lion's den, willing to stand firm in the heat. I think, people who sort of create a venue of conflict in which they're going to shine. It's just like, it's just like in school, there's a fight in the cafeteria, everybody comes running. So conflict it just draws immense amount of attention because everybody likes it. So people who don't engage in any conflict, like I'm the low conflict guy. I would prefer having just, nice conversations. Yeah. Probably, if I really wanted to boost my audience, I should have a much bigger fight with someone. I should just pick a fight with somebody and start going after them. And we'll talk about you in a minute on some unrequested conflict that came your way. But Shapiro and them went to campus, and he really did great. Jordan Peterson on that famous Channel 4 interview in the
Hmm.
UK, when that was such a huge brand builder for him, and so I think it was a great brand builder. But now Shapiro's intergalactic. I mean, he doesn't need to do that anymore, and so who's going to do it again? I know maybe there's not another. Maybe the moment, so to speak, has passed for that. It'll be interesting to see though.
Yeah, no, I think that that was definitely a particular moment in time. Another trend that I would point out, it's something that I don't want to over extrapolate, but it's something that I personally dealt with. I think very candidly, campuses have gotten a little bit more coy about how they approach these questions. They, especially in red states, campus administrators really don't want to be engaged either in the legal or media spectacle that a lot of these cancellations became. And so I think at a pure administrative, bureaucratic level, there have been sort of best practices adopted across college campuses to ensure that these events go as smoothly as possible because these campuses realize it's in their best interest to do so. And so that has also been a factor, is that there's just less of that. I also think that sort of the lefty elements that would have traditionally caused problems have gotten kind of tired. And there was a particularized generation that was really good at disrupting those, and that generation has moved on and hasn't necessarily replaced itself. And so I think those are some more reasons for why the cooling off has happened. But that kind of 2014 through 16, Milo Yiannopoulos and Ben Shapiro going from campus to campus, causing fires, $1 million lawsuits, and that sort of thing. That's not coming back. I think that was a very particularized moment in time.
Yeah, and they probably realize that they're just helping these people out. They're not really, they're just giving them free publicity,
Mm-hmm.
which is what people did with Trump, but they could never help themselves. They couldn't help but
Right.
give him free publicity by attacking him. So I want to talk about American Moment, the organization. Again, it's americanmoment.org. What is the organization? And, why did you start it, and what does it do?
Sure. So the organization was started because looking back on the Trump administration in the middle of last year, I and a couple friends of mine were seriously considering, okay, what went wrong and what went right. And it was clear that one of the things that went horribly wrong was personnel. That the president advocating for an agenda that I believe in, one of foreign policy restraint, immigration restriction, trade protection, a substantive social conservatism, a willingness to fight, all of this, that agenda sort of fell on deaf ears when it came to the permanent power structure in DC, the sort of class of unelected bureaucrats, political appointees, congressional staff, so on and so forth. There are people in this town who do politics as a living, who draw a taxpayer salary, but they're political appointees. They're hired on for congressmen, or they're hired on by a president. There's 4,000 political appointees, in fact, that happen during each administration, and that's just Schedule C. Forget the career stuff. We don't have a bench. We don't have a pipeline for personnel starting at the most junior levels that share that worldview to be found, educated, credentialed, and built up professionally so that they can take on those extremely important roles when a president gets elected. And it was my view essentially that problem was not going away, and that it was someone's moral responsibility to solve it. And I didn't see anyone else doing it, so I decided, okay, fine, I'll do it myself. And got a couple co-founders together and basically, built this. Drawing on experience that I had had doing similar work in Texas, leading an organization called Young Conservatives of Texas that was very interested in getting young people involved in a substantive way. But really, what our approach is that it's not my job to build a mass movement of young people to do anything. It's really just to find the people who have the worldview, the personality, and character to do this sort of very particular, very narrow work. That's not go be a pundit, go be a journalist. It's go in, be a congressional staffer, be a junior public policy staffer, be the sort of person that gets appointed to a mid-level role at the Department of Energy during President Trump II or Ron DeSantis's administration, so on and so forth. That's what the organization is built to do: is to identify, educate, and credential young Americans to do that sort of work, to implement public policy, not to think it up. There's people much smarter than me to do it, but to implement it, to be the kind of bodies in the room that make sure that things actually happen when we elect good people.
And what are the profiles of people you're looking to run through your program?
In some ways, there is no profile, and in other ways, there's an extremely narrow one. So, what are the things that I don't care about? I don't care if you have a college degree. In fact, I would prefer if you to be realistic. And the reason for that is because this is low-paying work, and if you have a ton of college debt, it's going to be a lot harder to do it for as long as you need to in order to build real institutional expertise and credibility if you have a whole bunch of debt. What's another thing I don't care about? I don't care about how much of an activist on campus you were. Someone who has the ability to put their head down and be a diligent operator behind the scenes, getting important stuff done, directing courage and strategic wisdom in an effective direction in a bureaucracy. That's a very different personality type than someone who can raise a poster on campus. And again, I'm not denigrating that. I did plenty of it. You Google my name, you'll find a lot of interesting photos of stuff I pulled when I was on college campus. But it's a little bit of a different personality type. So what is the profile then? It's people who share our worldview, and we're pretty exacting. When we get to pull from any young person in the country, I'm looking for people who are pretty darn aligned, who really understand these new issues that the conservative movement, the Republican Party are dealing with, whether it's things like trade and immigration, foreign policy restraint, really substantive social conservatism. How do we punch back as hard as with the left as they punch us, and so on. So making sure that we're pretty exacting on worldview, that on tactics we're selecting for the sorts of people who have the sort of impulse, the personality type to thrive in an environment where being a team player is extremely important. You have to work like gears in a well-oiled machine, hence our logo. And people who are of good character and fitness, because if you're going to stand arm in arm with people over the next 10, 15 years to build a movement, to build an apparatus together, they better be people you can tolerate having a beer with. And I have a certain kind of person that I like to have a beer with. So.
Yeah, when you listed like your 5 things, you did, I think you hit them all when you were just talking about that as what counts a line. And it really struck me from the very earliest days, people really put their finger on the 3 issues that constituted Trumpism. This might even go back to the old Journal of American Greatness that those guys had.
I think it's an Antonism. I think
it's an Antonism that it was about immigration restrictionism. It was about trade policies, more protectionist trade policies, and a less aggressive foreign policy.
Yep.
And so it's really interesting because, as you said, all of those really go against the traditional approach of kind of movement conservatism. There's always been sort of an immigration restrictionist kind of caucus, if you will, among it, but I think it was really more of a grassroots phenomenon than an establishment. When you go back to the famous Wall Street Journal, Bob Bartley, op-ed, "There shall be no borders," the constitutional amendment from the 80s. That was like, I want a constitutional amendment, "There shall be no borders." Yeah. And so there was some of that, but there was really very little. I mean, if you weren't pro-war, you were out.
Yep.
So like, all the people that went and started American conservatism, what do you really, are these, how did you just pick these because you thought these were the ones that were salient to the voters, or how did you alight on these particular issues yourself?
I think they're popular. I think that's certainly part of it, but I also think that they're responsive to the civilizational crises facing the country, right? How do you ensure that people can get married and have kids? You want an economy that actually is able to provide dignified work to people who aren't just 40-hour-a-week knowledge workers. You'd want a manufacturing base that's capable of giving people dignified work, even if they want to go in a more blue-collar direction. How would you ensure that those jobs aren't immediately taken away by the lowest class, serfs that are brought in by our corporate immigration lobby? You do some immigration restriction. A tight labor market is best for the low end of the wage spectrum. Similarly, our endless wars, sending, we can do all the pro-natalist policies we want, but if we send our kids to go die in some, desert in the Middle East, that's not pro-natalist, I think. It's not. And it also, I think, it speaks to a lack of humility on behalf of our ruling class. The idea that we should be spreading liberalism across the world at the point of a gun is just, it's not congruous with the other points of that worldview. Trade protection is similar as well. I mean, all of it comes down to, I think, a fundamentally humble posture, recognizing the human nature, recognizing the constraints of what government and society can accept, can assimilate at a given point in time, and maybe paring back some of the more universalist or idealist tendencies of liberalism, capital and lowercase l. And so those are some of the reasons we picked those issues. I think that the social conservatism is something that's essential as well. That's how you have families. That's how you ensure a competent and orderly social structure in which families can thrive. And all of these, I think, are integral to ensuring that we have a nation that is capable of retaining a respectable domain of influence and structure and posture in a world where there are rising powers and we're emerging into a multipolar world, whether it's potentially consolidating European Union, or more importantly, Russia and China, not to mention Russia or Africa or these other regions of the world. It's not the aftermath of World War II anymore, where the entire world was bombed to smithereens and we get to just sit atop fat and happy. That there are genuine challenges, genuine threats to the regime now, that have to be contended with, and the country needs to adopt a much more serious posture.
It's interesting. You're an immigrant who's kind of a little bit of an immigration restrictionist, and that's actually been true. I think there's a big strength of that. So Reihan Salam, who's a child of immigrants, he wrote a book, and to be honest, like Reihan was. He was really one of the few conservatives that the left loved. He was very popular. I think
he could write at the New Yorker.
He was welcome in that, and I think he cost himself some standing with the left when he wrote that book. Writing that, and he also, it's interesting. He also wrote Grand New Party with Ross Douthat, which I think was a little bit of a proto kind of Trumpism. It's like we should be thinking more about the genuine middle class more than the fat cats, which is interesting. And then way back in the day when he was still at National Review, Peter Brimelow and Alien Nation from way back when, that was sort of considered he was a mainstream figure at that point, and that was a mainstream book that he did. He went on the Today Show and the New York Times reviewed it. And he's from the UK. And I just think that's kind of interesting. Not necessarily good or bad, but I think it's interesting that people, just like everybody assumes, if you're a Mexican, you must want open borders with Mexico. That's just not the case at all. Immigrants have a wide spectrum of views on immigration. Just because you're an immigrant doesn't mean you want open borders.
Yeah, I think there's sort of three elements to it, right? One is going back to what I said earlier about how it's hard to know one country unless you know two, or one society unless you know two. You realize just how anomalous, how porous our borders are across the world. Like no other society does this for good reason. So there's that angle to it. Two, I think that immigrants immigrate for a reason. They leave the places they come from for a reason. They find something lacking in the place they left, and they come here to be part of something that they find more valuable. And so for me, I mentioned how the complete lack of law and order in India was very radicalizing for me. That's something that protective of, and then the lastly, I think that in some ways it's a little bit easier for us to be restrictionists. It's very hard for someone to call me a white nationalist. Believe me, people have tried, but it's a little bit easier. We have a little bit of a feather in our cap,
well, they call Clarence Thomas a white nationalist sometimes. So it's
but it's you get to laugh it off. Whereas it's funny. I think Ann Coulter once tweeted something about it, about this concept. I think at the time, J.D. Vance was being called a white nationalist, and you find out he has an immigrant wife, and it's like, oh, okay. But she made I think a fair point, which was that, okay, but what are those of us supposed to do who don't have immigrant wives when we get this slander thrown at us? So it's not something that I'm too excited about, because I recognize that it is just because I can insulate myself from that criticism doesn't mean it's not our responsibility to try to decrease the power that these utterly libelous terms have in American society, where just anyone can be labeled a racist, and that's the most evil sin someone can be capable of in American life. That is a system that we need to break down. But I think that those are some of the reasons why you find more restrictionist immigrants, especially in prominence of political life.
Yeah. I worked in the IT outsourcing industry for many years, and so I mean, like I know when I hear people talk about H-1B visas,
Yep.
for example, and I hear what all the corporate people are telling me, and like, oh, it's about all this amazing, this that, and I'm like, I was, as they say, I was in the room where it happened when we're being told, you must prove to me that you can't use the H-1B before you can actually have like an American citizen be staffed in this role. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the complete opposite of what we're told. It's like, and that told us like, it's like, first off, number one choice is offshore, direct offshore. Number two choice is H-1B or an L-1 or someone else who is, an offshore person working onshore. And then the last choice is to hire like an actual American citizen or green card holder.
Yeah.
And these poor guys, many of the ones I work with were from India. They're trying to get a green card, and so while they're trying to get their green card, they're spending huge amounts of money on lawyers, and the companies sort of got them. It's like they're like serfs. They're being taken advantage of,
Yeah.
and rather than giving them just okay, you're a great technology person, we'd love to have you here. Here's your green card. It's like no, we're going to make you spend years going through hoops and spending tons of money. So we got you, and now we're going to make you work for like lower wages. It's just it's an exploitation system. I'm sure that there are some. I'm sure that there are some people who are super high. Yes, there are probably some super high type people who end up on H-1Bs, but a lot of it's just about. It's about exploiting the immigrant. Even it's not even about.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. So I say when you have it's like the stuff that I have the firsthand knowledge about. I know that it's totally the opposite
Yeah.
of what is being sold to the public.
There's a great piece that a friend of mine, Pedro Gonzalez, has written for the American Mind called "Don't Bother Learning to Code," um, and it's kind of a play on the learn to code thing. The journalists love to say, and the reason why is because of H-1B and OPT. And I think that's in some ways, I struggle. What am I more of a restrictionist on? Is it low skill immigration or high skill? And I think there's particularly evil things about a porous regime on either end, but the idea that the original wisdom in American life was just go to college, whatever degree you get, it'll still help you. Okay, now it's like, well, you silly English majors, you got the wrong degree, but if you get a STEM degree, you'll be fine. Now you get your STEM degree, you show up in hand to Microsoft, and it's like, oh, sorry, your job's been outsourced through Tata Consulting Services. Very, very sorry, H-1Bs have come in and take it over. It's just it's indecent. It's not what a decent country does to its citizens, and it's why I oppose it so much.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it's not fair. There are some people who come over on H-1Bs. They just want to get some experience and then go back. But a lot, overwhelmingly, the people that I met who are on H-1B visas wanted to immigrate to the United States.
Yeah.
And so this limbo period really becomes the way that they're exploited.
Yeah.
And it's not good. So you mentioned J.D. Vance. He's on your board of advisors, I think it is, and
Yep.
so that's a pretty big get. How did you guys get connected with J.D. Vance?
Well, it's funny. The reason we exist is because of something J.D. Vance wrote. He wrote a piece for the American Mind in April of 2020 called "End the Globalization Gravy Train," and it talked about all sorts of things in that piece. But one of the things it talked about was how atrophied this personnel pipeline was. And it's funny because that Friday, I read the piece on a Wednesday. That Friday, I was scheduled to wrap up my tenure leading another organization. And I was ready to kick back my feet, retire, and go to law school. That was going to be the plan. And then I read this piece from JD, and I spend the entire night awake. And I'm a fairly chill person. I've never done that really before. And then I sort of think through, okay, here's how we could build something that can maybe solve this. And at 3:30 in the morning, I text my now co-founders, and we were off to the races. And by Thursday, we had decided we were going to do something new. I didn't give myself a single day break between everything. And so, the first four members of our boards of advisors were four friends of mine: Sagar and Jetty, Rachel Bovard, Ryan Girdusky, and Josh Hammer. And then I didn't know JD personally, but we had some friends reach out to him on our behalf and connect us, and spoke on the phone, and he agreed to join us as well. And in part out of recognition of how integral he was to us existing, in part because we think that he's truly a generational figure in terms of this strain of politics that we're interested in. We also just admire him a lot and look up to him. It was a slam dunk. The only question was, would we be able to square it away? And he was very gracious enough to join.
Mm-hmm. And why are people going to work with you? So if I'm a member of Congress and I need to staff my office, why am I going to call you to do it? So
I think
what's the kind of value proposition there, particularly if I'm like a chamber of commerce guy?
Sure, and that's an interesting question, right? So if you're explicitly ideologically aligned, you can think of some people who have been pioneers in sort of this vision of conservatism. It obviously makes sense. You want staff that are aligned.
Maybe JD Vance at some point.
Maybe there's all sorts of articles about him potentially running, and you know the goal is essentially for us to build up a cadre that does not only stand the test ideologically, but stands the test objectively. And what I mean by that is, I think that we have a sort of market dominant position in the staffing and personnel space because the sorts of people that are getting involved with us, they feel like they're the leading edge, and they're a persecuted minority within the party. So they're much more activated to do long-term work. They're much more willing to devote their personal time to it. They also feel particularly burned about the failures of personnel in the Trump era. So they're much more likely to be entrepreneurial. And C, I think that there's downstream consequences of a worldview that says, actually, yeah, government does have a role to play in preserving a healthy and just society that make people better at being government employees. And so our goal is to essentially make our cadre so high quality, sans the ideological assessment that a member of Congress might make, that just someone who's looking like, okay, I need to fill this staff position. I don't have a ton of time. They need to be high quality because these offices are whirlwind all day, every day. I'm just going to go to Saurabh and I'm going to ask him who he picks. And yeah, sometimes he has these wacky right wingers, but you know what? They do good work. They have a great reputation, and maybe they can help our office, be a little bit more in touch with the base on a given issue. Because frankly, we have no idea how we would even do that if we wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's the sort of thing that the more people who get in, the more they'll be more likely to bring other people in. So once you get going, it kind of becomes a flywheel a little bit.
That's the idea, right? Is to have like for like hire itself. And so our kids, as they move up in the process, we'll hope, and it's something we talked about, is like, please pick from the pool that you were a part of, because that's how you complete this ideological paradigm shift is by rewarding friends and punishing enemies, as Mike Anton likes to say.
I'm assuming that you have a lot of people who are applying to be part of your program.
We do. So we launched our organization on February 24th of this year. And one element of our programming is something called the Fellowship for American Statecraft. Now, that's a tool for us to launder people with a non-traditional background into staffing in DC, help people get their first job where there otherwise would be challenges. We're helping lots of people get their first job, but when there may be particularized issues, maybe they're a college dropout, they didn't go to college, or maybe some other concern. Maybe they come from a socioeconomic background that would make it hard for them to do an unpaid internship in DC, which is what a lot of them are. We even have 2 married guys in our program, because if you're married, you better have a baseline level of income. You can't screw around with $800 a month stipend. And so we launched this program, and we had 8 spots at the time. We ended up growing to 10 spots, and you would expect with something like this, if you were an incumbent organization, standard one, 5 to 6 times the amount of applicants as you have spots is pretty standard. That's what's expected. We ended up having 21 times as many applications as we had spots. We had 207 people apply for the fellowship, which was just insane. It was not, we did not expect that. We could not have expected it. If I'd promised that, I would have sounded like a clown during the stage of our organization. But we did, because again, people were very hungry for something real and something substantive that gave them a path forward, that said, no, we're just not. I think that there's a big problem, and I think it touches on themes that you've talked about a lot in your scholarship and kind of public witness. But there's lots of institutions in American life that just want to equip young people. They're big fans of equipping them, equipping young leaders. I think young people need to be formed, and they need to be given direction in a much more guided way than the term equipping would lead you to believe. There's sort of this characteristic in liberalism that people are this blank slate, this unbloomed flower, and all they need is to be watered, and they'll become the best version of themselves. It's just not true. And so I think a combination of the path that we laid out, the confidence with which we said, no, this is the way that you should approach making an impact, the worldview that I think is much more consonant with serious young people who want to make an impact, and then also, the fact that we were generously funded enough to do it. That all kind of confluenced itself into making the program a huge hit. And we actually just finished orientation with the first 10 fellows last Thursday and Friday, and they're just as impressive in person as we thought they were over all the interviews we did.
Great. Well, it'll be interesting to see like where they land and how it turns out. I mean, it's always interesting to start something.
Yeah.
Starting is it's like Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. Getting something off the ground is like a heavy lift.
Extremely, and the timeline that we had to get it all sorted was just extremely attenuated. I mean, again, it was all contingent on the organization launch, which was contingent on funding questions. And so when we launched on February 24th, it was like off to the races. Process all 207 of these applications, interview dozens of them, then find the destination organizations. So they've been placed everywhere from the Senator Josh Hawley's office, the Republican Study Committee, to the Center for Immigration Studies and American Principles Project, and so on. Building those relationships. Thankfully, we've been working on that for a long time, aligning the right fellow with the right destination organization, building out the curriculum for their Friday sessions where we bring them back to our office to teach them about politics and policy. It all happened on a very rapid timeline. Everyone thought we were insane for doing it on our first, in really year zero. What I like to say is we're pursuing a year 3 agenda in year 0, and wouldn't have it any other way.
I said that you're not necessarily like a high conflict guy. You don't like to make it personal, but somebody decided to make it a little personal for you. Maybe that the folks at the National Review sort of critiqued your organization. I don't know, maybe the critique's too strong a word, but they're like, "What the heck is this thing, and why do we need this?" I guess you might say. And so, what was that like to first the National Review actually notice what you were doing, which has to feel good. And
yeah,
then,
I think a lot of people noticed what we were up to. I know for a fact that a lot of people did. We were very lucky. I spent sort of the year between April of 2020 and February of 2021 building relationships with a lot of important players in the space, such that when we launched, it wouldn't be like just a drop in the pond. It would be a little bit more splashy than that, because so much of our ability to do our job relies on people knowing who we are, both in terms of young people who want to get involved knowing to come to us, and then also employers kind of being generally, oh, okay, yeah, I know what that group does. I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did that. And, one of the submissions editor at National Review, his name is Jack Butler. He took umbrage with what we were doing. I think he had a clever title, something like "Wait One American Moment," or something like that. And he had a variety of criticisms, some of which I think were sort of confused, intellectually speaking. He would say stuff like, "How can you be populists because you guys had a launch party where there were cocktails?" And it's just kind of silly, sophistic, I think, to be honest. And he took great umbrage with our logo, for instance. He said, their logo, which evokes the dehumanizing logic of the administrative state or something. I was like, okay, this is kind of strange, and also just a broad critique where he said, these guys don't want to drain the swamp; they want to replace the swamp, and that I think goes.
Yes, actually, isn't that one might be true?
Well, it is, but I also think that also kind of misrepresents the reality, which is that we could decimate the administrative state tomorrow. Literally, the original meaning of the term decimate, make 1/10 of what it was. And there would still be those 4,000 political appointees that have to be made in every administration in order to govern Department of State, Department of Energy, Department of Education, and so on. Maybe you get it down to 2,000, 2,500. Someone needs to fill those spots. And I think that there's a certain member of the incumbent order that would very much like for them to be the ones filling those spots. And I think that if we're going to ensure the future of the party and the movement is in the direction I'd like it to go, we have to be attentive of that. And so, it seemed like kind of an all over the place criticism. That was a criticism that a lot of people levied, that it seemed a little bit disjointed and seemed personal. I'm not sure why. I've always liked Jack. I used to actually listen to his podcast and still do occasionally. And we weren't personal in our response either. We just thought it was a great opportunity to talk more about what it is that we're doing, what we care about. And I don't use it to necessarily indict the entirety of National Review either, although I have my issues with a lot of the writers there. That was one writer who has self-publishing privileges. deciding to engage in a bromide against us. And it's funny that the most compelling response, in fact, the most sharp-tongued response actually came from another National Review contributor, which was Mark Krikorian, who's the president of the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies, who's a contributor there. So he wrote a very sharp response to Jack. And so, again, so, we like to be measured in who we criticize and whether or not we ascribe the entire institution to it. And so it was sort of a strange set of interactions, but it got us some more attention. It got more people interested. I think there were at least a couple people who applied for the fellowship and kind of reached out on our contact form and even gave money saying, well, if National Review has an issue with you, you're probably doing something right. So thank you for helping us do our job.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, this idea of like replacing the swamp, and I do think this is where I part ways with conservatives in a lot of ways. Is I don't think conservatives have really understood the implications, still haven't understood the full implications of industrialization.
Yep.
And one of them is the scale, the emergence of large scale organizations. And I'm just kind of like drawing on James Burnham here, led to a change to a managerial society. And so this idea that we're going to eliminate the administrative state, we're not going to ever eliminate the administrative state.
Yeah.
Because when you have large organizations, large businesses, large cities, large companies, which we have big, in an era of geopolitical competition with China or whatever, we're not going to become a small is beautiful country, right? You actually, the thing has to be administered. And the question is, who's going to administer it? And how are they going to administer it? And so you can't just have a couple, people at the top making all the calls. That's a model that doesn't work in today's world.
Yeah, my friend Oren Cass, who runs American Compass, has talked about this before. Public policy gets made every day in Washington, D.C. The question is, do we want to participate in it? And my critique has been, it seems like that the incentive structure, the reward mechanism for conservatives over the last 10 to 20 years has been that in order to be a conservative in good standing, you essentially have to opt out of the public policy process. You have to say, no, I'm going to, in order to be in good standing with my worldview, not participate. I'm going to be a no on whatever the issue is. And guess what? Public policy is getting made every day. It'd be one thing if that stopped public policy from getting made, if things didn't happen, but they do. We haven't decreased the size of the administrative state. We barely slowed it down. We haven't decreased the size of government. We haven't decreased the debt. We haven't done any of that. And so I think that it's worth at least hedging by saying that, okay, maybe we're still going to try to pursue decreasing the size, but let's devote some resource to ensuring that when public policy is made, that our people are in the room, informed by our values, informed by conservative, small c conservative values on faith and family, on the contours of a just society, and be part of that process, because there's all sorts of implications for governance, even on the margins that we can influence. One of my favorite examples of what this looks like in practice is something like what almost ended up happening during coronavirus with the stimulus checks. If you remember, the original structure was $1,200 for every adult in a house, and I think it was $500 for every dependent. And so if you do sort of the math on it, okay, if you're a single person, you get $1,200 per person, great. If you're a married couple, $1,200 per person, great. Married couple with 2 kids, okay, now you do the math, that's $3,400 divided by 4. You're suddenly at something like $850 per kid. Well, that's interesting. That's or $850 per person within a family unit. That's interesting. That's a choice. Marco Rubio, for instance, proposed a different structure. He said $1,000 per person, whether you're a dependent or a standalone adult or not. And so what are you doing then? You increase the average that the family of 4 would get from $850 to $1,000. You increase the average that a family of 6 would get from probably in the low 600s to $1,000. That is a substantively pro-family policy. It's a tiny example of how our values, the things we appreciate and believe are essential to civilization as conservatives, can imbue and infuse public policy, and we avoid it at our peril.
I got one final question for you is, to all the boomers out there who are watching this, what is your message to the boomers? What, if as the representative of Gen Z, and the Gen Z conservatives, what would you really like them to understand and know?
It's not 1960 anymore. The challenges that faced America during, say, the years when Ronald Reagan became president are fundamentally different from the challenges that face us now. College used to cost a nickel. It does not cost a nickel anymore. Going to college, unless you're going to very particular ones that are essentially glorified hedge funds with school of liberal divinity attached to them, is essentially what they are. Going to a mid-tier, C-tier school just to accrue $100,000 in debt is basically it's not a death sentence, but you're consigning a young person to a pretty terrible life. You're making it so they're not going to be able to buy a home, they're not going to be able to get married, they're not going to be able to have kids. That the runaway credentialism has made it so that not only that you're going to need a bachelor's degree to get a good job, you're going to need a master's, you're going to need a PhD. And that is just consigning people to ever delayed adolescence and ever delayed adulthood. It's a terrible way to raise a country. This is not 1960 anymore in terms of the threats we face from the left. The left is energized and activated in an affirmatively authoritarian way, and they're coming for you and your kids. This is not Queensberry's rules anymore. Our political opponents are serious about acquiring power. They're very good at it, and they're intent on it. Russia is not the biggest threat that we face. China is more so. But the answer is not to respond to China the exact same way we did to Russia. Just adopting a Cold War mindset won't solve the problem. On dozens of issues, we just live in a fundamentally different country faced by fundamentally different challenges than we did once upon a time. Things that were once easy are no longer. Things that were once hard are no longer. And recognize that the challenges that the young people in your life are facing are fundamentally different. And if you see yourself as someone who votes for the future of your kids, I hear from a lot of people, they vote Republican because they worry about the national debt and what they're giving to their kids. If that truly is the posture that you have, there may be things even more important than the national debt worth voting about and worth selecting for when political leaders come to you with a platform and you have a chance to make an impact about that.
Well, the one thing that you talked about that really excited me was the fact that you guys don't require a college degree in order for you to work with them. It's easy. Everybody likes to complain about credentialism, but you're actually saying, no, we're not going to be a credentialist. We're going to try to be there.
I'd prefer it.
We're going to try to be your credential. You're essentially trying to be an alternative credentialing mechanism for those people.
Yep.
And that's really great. So again, Saurabh, thank you for taking the time to talk today. And again, he's the president of American Moment, AmericanMoment.org. Visit the site, check it out. Follow him. What's your Twitter handle?
At @SharmaUS. And American Moment is AMMoment.org on all platforms.
All right, check him out. Give him a follow. And good luck with your initiative there. And I'll look forward to seeing great success ahead.
Thank you, Aaron. And we're looking forward to seeing you here soon, too.
That's right.